guys, Richard Older here. Thanks for watching the video and thanks for supporting the channel. Here's the question for today. Supercharged GT500 5.4 liter, you know, the Shelby motor versus GM LS3. Which one makes more power? I know what you're thinking. Richard, that's a blower motor versus an NA motor. What happens if both of them are supercharged? In this video, we have the classic Camaro versus Mustang shootout. In the Ford corner, we have the 5.4 liter Ford modular 4-valve GT500 motor modified versus a 6.2 liter LS3, both of them equipped with the Kenne 2.8 liter twin screw supercharger. In our comparison between our Camaro motor and our Mustang motor, obviously we're taking a look at a 5.4 liter supercharged Shelby GT500, and then the ideal other comparison for that would be the ZL1 Camaro. Unfortunately, I didn't ever run a ZL1 engine on the engine dyno, so the closest thing I have is an LS3, which has higher compression, obviously, than the ZL1 motor does, but in all fairness, our GT500 motor also had higher compression because it was a modified version. So let's take a look at the GT500 combination first, and then we'll take a look at what happened when we ran our supercharged LS3. Then we can compare the two. Lots of good stuff going on here. So our GT500 motor was actually a 10-to-1 static compression motor. We put forged rods and forged pistons in it. It had custom spec cams by John Mahovitz over at ACCUFAB. I don't have the specs here, and he honestly doesn't remember because I checked with him to find out. So I don't have the specs here. There are cams that he has run many, many times in these 5.4 liters and the later 5.8 liter stuff, and he's made a bajillion horsepower out of these things. But we ran this thing. I wanted to run this thing NA. They almost never do that. They usually just put the blower on there and or put turbos on there. But I wanted to run this thing NA to establish kind of a baseline before we added boost to it. In order to do that, we needed an intake manifold. Mahovitz had a lower portion of a Cobra R intake, did not have the upper portion, so I made an upper portion, and that allowed us to mount a dual blade throttle body on this thing. We also ran this with, it was 10-to-1, it had the cams, had the Cobra R intake with the Super Richie plenum. We ran it with 2-inch long tube headers and with a fast XFI management system. Run in this manner, it made right at 500 horsepower, 499.7, and peak torque checked in at 442 foot-pounds. So the first thing that we did on our GT500 motor was take off the NA induction system and put the GT500 stock stuff back on. Here's what happened when we ran the stock blower, stock pulley, stock throttle body, stock intercooler, air to water with the ambient dyno water. This thing made about 7.2 pounds on this combination and 663 horsepower. Peak torque checked in at 579 foot-pounds. Now you could run more boost with the stock blower. It will support more, especially if you put a bigger throttle body and ACCUFAB makes an elbow and all that stuff for it. So you could go up, but what we did was we replaced the blower, because if you want to make a lot of power, ultimately that factory GT500 blower is going to be kind of limiting. So what we did was step up in blower size. In this case, we put a Kenne 2.8 liter twin screw supercharger on there, and this was actually a 2.8 liter H version, which is the high boost version. So it was modified so it would be more efficient at the higher boost levels, because we eventually did run a lot of boost from this thing. So the first thing we did was run this thing with the Kenne 2.8 liter, and we put a 3.25 inch blower pulley on it. That thing allowed the Kenne to exceed 14 pounds of boost and exceed 750 horsepower, 757 horsepower. Peak torque checked in at 620 foot-pounds of torque. You can see it made good power, and it's continuing to rise in power. If we take a look, from 6,000 to 6,500, we gained 50 horsepower, and it's still going up at the same level. So if we continue to rev this thing, which this 4-valve 5.4 liter would easily rev another 1,000 RPM probably, but this was our self-imposed red line of 6,500 RPM. This wasn't my motor, actually belonged to the guys at Kenne. So we would eventually run a lot more boost than this, but we'll get into that after we take a look at the LS3. Now that we've taken a look at the power output of our supercharged GT500 4-valve 5.4 liter motor, it's time to take a look at the LS3. Now, unfortunately, right off the bat, we've got a problem because I did not run the LS3, the 6.2 liter LS3, naturally aspirated before we ran it with the Kenne. We just did a bunch of testing with the Kenne, And unfortunately, I don't have an NA version with that specific cam. So all I can do is give you an idea of where it might be. I'll show you a cammed LS3 power curve, which is this right here. And then we'll talk about the difference between this camshaft and the one that we use on the supercharged combination. We used this same motor. Again, it just had a different camshaft in it. So this combination was run, it was an NA LS3 crate motor. Again, the same one that we ran with the Kenny Bell. It was the exact same motor. In fact, we ran this combination with a Comp 54-459-11 cam, which is a good and naturally aspirated cam. It's a cathedral port cam, and this was obviously a rec port motor, but guess what? It works just as well. That camshaft was a 617-624 lift. It was a 231-239 degree duration split and 113 degree lobe separation angle. We ran it with long tube headers, all of the factory LS3 stuff, heads, intake manifold. We did run it with a manual 92mm throttle body, and naturally this thing had springs in it to work with that camshaft. Run and optimized with the Holley HP management system. We ran on 91 octane. This cammed LS3 produced 565 horsepower and 517 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened when we ran our Kenny Bell combination with the other camshaft. We'll get into that. Here's our Kenny Bell combination. That was run with a 3.75-inch blower pulley, making a peak boost of 9.5 pounds, and the boost rose from 8 pounds to 9.5 pounds. That camshaft was actually a dedicated blower cam from Brian Tooley Racing. It was a stage 3, which offered a 617-595 lift split, a 231-248 degree duration split, so much more exhaust duration, and a much wider LSA at 120 degrees. What that camshaft would do compared to our NA camshaft is that it would tend to push power higher out in the RPM range. It would be softer down low, as we've seen many times with like the LS9 camshaft and the LSA camshaft. But this shows what the Kenny Bell combination did, and it produced over 750 horsepower. In fact, it was over 760 horsepower, 767, and peak torque checked in at 643 foot-pounds of torque. So we showed that both the GT500 was capable of exceeding 750 horsepower, and this Supercharged Ls3 was capable of exceeding 750 horsepower. So now let's take a look at a comparison between the supercharged versions of our two motors, and then I can show you what happened when we cranked the boost up on the GT500. To whet your appetites before I give you the comparison between the 5.4 liter and the 6.2 liter, I'm going to show you the differences in boost pressure. And this is the boost curve supplied by the Kenny Bell on our modified 5.4 liter GT500 motor. It started out around down near 3,500 RPM, 9.75, and then rose to a peak at 6,500 here of 14.2 pounds. This is in comparison to the curve offered by the Kenny Bell on the LS. You can see quite a bit less boost, and as we'll see, these are actually making fairly comparable power, but because our LS3 would be starting out with more naturally aspirated power, it required less boost from the Kenny Bell, or developed less boost. So we started out about 8 pounds on the Kenny Bell with the LS3, and it rose to about 9.4 pounds, 9.5 pounds out here at 6,600 RPM. And just to whet your appetite a little bit more, I'll show you what we're going to be adding to the GT500. Here's where we're going to be taking that thing, and that's the boost all the way up here. Yes, you're seeing that right. That is 25 pounds of boost out here at 6,600 RPM. So enough about the boost curves. Let's take a look at the power. The number one reason for the difference in the boost pressure required to reach basically similar power outputs, and we're going to show you that in just a second, is the difference in the NA power output. Our 5.4 liter modified GT500 motor produced right at 500 horsepower and 442 foot-pounds of torque. In comparison, the larger LS3 produced quite a bit more naturally aspirated power and more power everywhere. We see, even though this wasn't exactly the same camshaft, we would see very similar peak power numbers. We might see a little bit less torque, but regardless, it's going to make a lot more power basically than our modified GT500 motor. So 565 horsepower and 516 foot-pounds. Even if we drop that down to say 500 foot-pounds and maybe 550 horsepower with the difference in the blower camshaft, but the blower would also work with this camshaft if we would have run this camshaft. But regardless, the bigger 6.2 liter made more power than the smaller 5.4 liter, even in modified trim. So now let's take a look at, I'm going to go ahead and show you the differences in the power on our supercharged versions. So this was the 5.4 liter with the Kenne bell making a little over 14 pounds. And this is our LS3 making a little 9.5 pounds or so. Again, similar power curves. The LS3 was making more power kind of all the way through. And, you know, we see here in the middle, the torque difference was 616 versus 642. So the supercharged LS3, even at a lower boost level, because it started out with more power, it's bigger and was more efficient than the 5.4 liter combination that we happened to put together. It started out with more power and ended up with more power even at a lower boost level. But we didn't start there. We didn't run the Kenne Bell Supercharged LS3 any higher than this. We did run the 5.4 liter quite a bit higher than this, and I'll show you what happened. I kind of teased that in the boost area. In the boost version, here's what happened when we eventually ran about 25 pounds on the Kenne Bell. So we easily exceeded 1,000 horsepower. We had 1,027 and 867 foot-pounds of torque. This thing would eventually go on to make a lot more power than this. In fact, I think that they pushed this with a different blower, a slightly different, I think a different set of camshafts. This thing would eventually go on to make over 1,500 horsepower. So it's certainly possible to make lots of power with the 5.4 liter, as Mohowitz has shown many, many times. But this was just this particular test. So we ran this cool dual, like ram's horn air intake to try to maximize the air going into the blower. And we put a 2.5-inch blower pulley on it. And all of this was run on race gas so that we could optimize the airfill and timing. And put enough timing in it to make good power. So in a comparison between a GT500 and a Supercharged LS3, both of them will make lots of power. It really just depends on how much boost you want to run. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what did we learn from this little adventure comparing our 5.4 liter 4-valve GT500 in modified trim versus our 6.2 liter LS3? And right off the bat, you 6.2 liter LS3 guys, don't get up in arms because we ran a whole bunch more boost on the GT500 to make it win. You must be a Ford guy. Go ahead and comment all you like. That's not the case. We just happened on the test that we ran on the GT500, we just happened to run a lot more boost. I didn't do that on my crate motor LS3 for obvious reasons, although we did make a lot of power. I wanted to demonstrate more that you could make easily 750 horsepower with either one of these combinations, and that starting out with a specific naturally aspirated power output allowed us to do it at different boost levels on two wildly different motors, despite the fact that both of them were making near 750 horsepower. So is this going to make the Camaro guys choose a Mustang engine or the Mustang guys choose a Camaro engine? Absolutely not. Here's another thing I want you guys to comment about. If I can get like, let's say I can get 100 comments from you GT500 guys, who wants to see a header shootout on a supercharged 5.4 liter? I think that I ran a variety of different header sizes, might have even run shorty headers and stock exhaust manifolds. Who wants to see what headers do on a supercharged GT500 motor? Let me know in the comments, and if I get enough comments, I'll go ahead and do a video on just header combos. I'm Richard Earl. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More testing coming up.